Grief is such an overpowering emotion, especially after losing someone so close to you. It can take months, years, even decades to get back to normal, if that's even possible after experiencing a significant loss. This podcast was created to help you move through and release the emotions, allowing you to heal the hurt and begin living again. Listen in as I chat with medical professionals, grief workers, and people who have first-hand experience in losing a loved one, what their experience has been, and what they did to help heal themselves and those around them. Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows, but I believe there is always a silver lining if you're willing to look. Welcome to the Release Podcast. Welcome to another episode of Release Grief Podcast. I'm your host, Faith Sage, and I am here with the wonderful Mr. Michael Neeley, who I had the pleasure of meeting on what's called the podcast cruise. And that happened a few months ago. And for me, it was great. I got a ton of knowledge, ton of information, and got to meet a whole wealth of people that are directly impacting my world at this moment. So if you haven't checked out the podcast cruise, please do. I'm already slotted and scheduled to go on next year's cruise in 2025. Well, at the time of this recording, it's next year. But welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for being on a podcast that talks all about grief. Some people don't like to share stories or talk about anything that's grief related. So thank you for being a part of this.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Faith. I love that you've created this podcast because it's so super valuable. And as far as the podcasters cruise, it was so great to meet you and your husband, Gordon, and just love you guys and look forward to sharing with your audience as well.
Yeah. So a lot of people get tripped up when I ask them, especially when they come from like the business world, because you're not directly in the grief world at all.
Mm-mm.
You come from more like the business, like building lists, building, what do you do? Tell me what you do. Let's
Well,
go ahead and bring that one in.
yeah, sure. Well, just background, I used to be a professional actor, but when I shifted out of that career and got into entrepreneurism, I started coaching podcasting. I host 6 of my own shows. So I do the Podcasters Cruise, where my partner and I are the founders of it, my fiance, Krista. And in addition to that, we have a company called The Infinite List, where we help entrepreneurs to grow their list, which is the lifeblood of any business. And so we do that as well.
Nice. I love
Yeah.
that. And so why did you want to be on for grief? Like I mean, business and grief, granted, there's a lot of grief in business.
Yeah.
There's a lot of business and grief, and vice versa. But what
Mhm.
made you want to be on this podcast? Because this wouldn't be your normal, typical podcast to be on.
No, it wouldn't. But when you asked me about it, and I thought of a story that's really near and dear to my heart, is about the loss of my mother, of course. And I've lost other siblings as well. But what's really interesting about this particular element of it is there's more depth and nuance to that level of grieving. That part of it was I did an ayahuasca medicine journey down in Costa Rica. And it was in this process that I discovered more about, oh, these other levels of the grief. And one of my shows, Consciously Speaking, is why I was down and doing this anyway. And so that's also near and dear to my heart around that. And so I thought it'd be a great opportunity to really share about that the first time.
I love you mentioned the ayahuasca. So, because I have talked with other people that have been on here for the ayahuasca stuff. I've never
Mhm.
dove into it. I've obviously been, well, maybe not obviously, but I've been super curious about it. And have even talked about doing that with my husband and stuff. What was that experience like? Like you said, there was multiple levels of grief that
Yeah.
came up during that ceremony.
During the ceremony. And to
Oh,
be clear, I mean, it wasn't the first time I'd ever done ayahuasca.
okay.
And while I was in at this retreat center, it's called Rhythmia Life Advancement Center down in Costa Rica, and you do 4 nights straight of ayahuasca.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and one of those nights they were doing was. For those of you who may know a little bit about ayahuasca, it's known as the mother ayahuasca. And in this particular night, they were calling in mother energy.
Mm.
And yeah, what happened, I mean, it was just multiple levels up. Try not to get too emotional as I talk about it, but it was really powerful.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard from a lot of people that it's extremely powerful and invokes tons of emotion
Yeah.
within. And it just takes you on a journey all on its own. I don't know. I've
Yeah.
not been there yet. I wanna go at some point in time. I will
Yeah. I
probably.
highly recommend it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Um, how did this help you, like, with your grief? How did this, take you through those levels, and what were they?
Yeah. Yeah, multiple ways, and there were some other epiphanies that evolved for me in this process. But let me just do a little bit of a backtrack on this. So my mother
Mm,
died at 86.
mhm,
And I remember at her 80th birthday party, we did a big blowout for her 80th. And she even said, some of us were just teasing around and joking with her, like, hey, we look forward to doing this again when you're 90. And my mother was just, she's a sweetheart of a lady, but she could also be like, oh, hell, I don't want to be here when I'm 90. I'm ready to go, kind of a thing. That's just always been her attitude towards getting older. She was like feeling ready to go, kind of a
mhm,
deal. And so there was that element that was like we were all kind of prepared for it when she was 86. And she was, like I said, she had lived a long, good life. She had seen two of her children pass, which I think is tough on
mm,
any person, but she's so super strong. And the thing that was really an eye opener for me, it was just like during the ayahuasca medicine journey, a couple things. One is often when you do ayahuasca, there's this process called purging,
mm.
and most of the time you're throwing up. Okay, it's
Oh,
your body
okay,
purges the medicine out, but in that process, you're also cleaning out kind of like energetic toxins, if you will.
okay.
But at this particular time in Costa Rica, I did not throw up at all. But another way that you can purge is through tears. And
Mm,
I was just, my eyes were watering consistently throughout, and I was feeling the crying. And my mother came to me in a vision and said, as long as those tears are, you're having those tears, that's me, basically,
oh,
saying I'm still there with you. So that was really cool. But the other thing that was an epiphany for me was I was kind of like the white sheep of the family, if you will, instead of the black sheep. I mean, I was the one who went off to college while everybody else kind of stayed home and, local. And I was the one who went out to explore the world and see everything. And white sheep, black sheep, however you want to frame it.
mhm,
So I wasn't around a lot. And I had this epiphany that whenever I would go home, and I would maybe see my mom once a year. I was living so many thousands of miles away, but would come home around a holiday. And I felt like part of it that opened my eyes in this process was that it was really hard for me to watch her get older and more frail and start falling apart. And that was tough. And it was part of why um, I think, didn't go back more. And I think part of it too came to me was that it was somehow underlying was my own inner fear about my own aging
yeah,
as I was getting older, and then being so sad, seeing her and witnessing that was really tough for me. And so I dealt with a lot of my grief around that, of just not being around as much. Mm. So I cried a lot during that process and really felt all of this fully.
yeah, it sounds like it. I've heard multiple stories on I've talked with a few people about it, and just the intense emotions that you feel, and that they've all mentioned the vomiting, the purging,
Yeah.
and all of that, and I don't know if maybe that scares me the most, I don't know why, but the tears don't bother me. They used to. I used to hate crying,
Hmm.
used to do all those things, but now
Yeah, I
then
don't mind that.
and then
I
I
don't
got
like throwing up.
into the grief world, and I, like, cry all the time now.
Yeah, yeah.
It tends to show you. But I remember when my father passed away and just, he had cancer, and it was an aggressive cancer, and it
Mm.
just within a couple months, he went into this, like, shell of a man who used to be, like, this big, massive hulk of a guy, And it was so hard to watch him just
Hmm.
almost like wither away.
Yeah.
And then when he was at the hospital, he slept with one eye open, for the
Mm.
longest time, like 4 or 5 days. It was like with one eye open, just the one eye. And then
Mm.
eventually, once all the family got there, it's amazing how our, the world around us lets us know, with our loved ones that they're still here, that they're
Hmm.
still guiding us, that they're still with us, that it's not like just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not here.
Yeah.
Um, because once the family got there, he closed his eyes, and then I think it was the next day he was gone. And so I don't know if he was just waiting. I think he was scared to close his eyes or whatever it was. I don't know. I was not nearly as far in my journey as I am now at that point in time. That was
Hmm.
almost 20 years ago. And yeah, so after you got done with the ceremony, you said this was I don't know how many that you have done with the ceremonies. Were they all about your mom, or was it just this big
No.
one came
No, it
up?
was just that one night that it came up in particular. And to be clear about timeline is a little bit odd. So I want to be real clear on that. So my mother passed in 2016, and I did
Okay.
have some guilt around that as well at the time because when she died, I was in the process. I was running a virtual summit called the Conscious
Mm.
Life Summit, and I got a call from my sister saying that she was in the hospital again, and she had been in the hospital in and out for the last year or two. She had fall and break something or have this other
Mhm.
little mishaps. And so while I wasn't too worried at the time, and they were even saying, don't worry, she's in the hospital, I'm like, should I get on a plane? Should I get coming out there? And I was ready to come home, and then the next call I got from them, she'd passed. So when she
Oh,
did go,
wow.
then it happened quickly, so I didn't get to be there. So I had some guilt around that. um, and then of course was out there for the funeral and all started to process the grief. But the other thing was it was the kind of lingering grief though that would go dormant for a while and then pop up one day. I would just feel this overwhelming rush of like, oh, I really miss my mom. So there were those moments. And it wasn't until this was 2016, it wasn't until like 20 I think it was 2019, so 3 years later, that I did. I want to make sure I'm getting this right on my timeline. Yeah, I think it was 2019 when I did the ayahuasca journey. So it was 3 years after she had passed that then it came up in that process, and that was really I think also a way for me to kind of complete it a little bit. Now, obviously, I still feel sadness and I miss my mom, but it was a way for me to really finish processing all of it and get these other openings that came to me in that. So that was, yeah, that was 2019. So six
Oh,
years ago.
wow. Yeah, and you said there was only one night for with your mom, and then the
No,
other 3 nights,
right.
other issues,
Different
other.
experiences would come up.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
And is that normal for the ayahuasca stuff? Or is
Well, yeah,
it
you just never know, kind of know what's going to come up. Now, it's funny in the world of what I call these medicine journeys, and because it could be ayahuasca as that medicine that you're using, but it
Mhm.
could also be done with other things. Like I know people who do these types of journeys in mushrooms, MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy. You can do this guided type of a journey,
Mhm.
and I actually guide people on these often. And as much as you can go into it, even setting an intention. I always like
Mhm.
to say that you may come in with an intention, but the medicine has an intention of its own. And
Okay.
while you may go in thinking, I want this, Mother Ayahuasca is very wise and will provide you what you really need. And so that was, and at the time that I did that particular night of that journey, I'd probably done ayahuasca, I don't know, 7 or 8 times before and not had any experiences around this, but this one, and really did bring in the mother energy there. So.
Okay. Now you mentioned that you guide people through these. Are you a
Mhm.
shaman?
No, I'm not a shaman. I don't guide ayahuasca journeys.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I was
Right, but
like,
I do other type of medicine
mhm.
journeys. Yeah.
Oh, I see. I see. How does the grief like show up in your work with business and stuff like that? And then how do you I don't want to say like fix it or cure it or
Mhm.
like how do you work through it? That's a
Yeah,
better
yeah.
word.
No, that's great because yeah, I would say you don't want to try to get rid of it.
No, no.
I just believe in feeling your feelings, process
Okay.
your feelings. When you try to tamp it down, it just is not really effective. It's going to come up in some other way or come out sideways or other stuff. And so it's really important to just feel it. I'm not, I don't have a lot of grief now because of the work that I've done on myself and processed through these things. And since then, my sister has died. She passed in 2020.
Okay.
Um, so uh, the I process pretty quickly, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And then the other part is that I do believe one of my, as a matter of fact, I was being guided on a medicine journey on MDMA at one point, and I got this download that energy flows into us from the universe, whatever you may call
Mhm.
that for any person. It could be you call it from the divine, from the universal energy, from the one, whatever that may be. And I feel like energy is energy. So imagine this energy flows into us. And
Mhm.
imagine if you're a kid and you remember this, I remember playing with the little Play-Doh machine that has the little slide, and you could push the Play-Doh through, and it would either come out like spaghetti, or it come out like a star, or come out like a tube. And just based on what you changed on the little slider.
Yep.
And so for me, and while I was having this epiphany during this medicine journey, I had the realization that energy just flows, and we control how it manifests itself. If this is
Oh,
making
yeah.
sense to you.
That
And
makes
so,
perfect sense.
yeah, so you can manifest it as grief, you can manifest it as anger, you can manifest it as sexual energy. I mean, all of the different types of energy flow, but it's the same energy. It's just how is it going to manifest and process through what's going on with us at that time. That makes
Okay.
sense?
Yeah. Almost like you're filtering it.
Yeah.
And however you filter it is how it's going to mainly show
Yeah.
up.
And energy is energy. And yeah, and then we can see how it hits and lands in us. And how do I want to move this energy through me? And if it is grief that's feeling like, oh, I'm feeling this edge of grief in me right now, let's use this energy to process this grief and let it flow out. Or maybe it comes in and it's like, oh, I'm feeling this energy flowing in, and I've got this part of some creativity that's going on. So let me translate it into creative energy. And so that's kind of the way I look at energy.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. I don't think ever had anyone explain it like that. That's
I've
really
never heard
good.
anybody explain it that way either.
Because yeah, it's emotions are just energy in motion.
Hmm.
And if you
Yeah,
bottle them, then you keep bottling up all this energy, and it's just eventually it's just going to explode, and
right.
usually it's never where you want it, never at the time you want it,
Exactly.
never in front of the people that you want it to be in front of,
Yeah.
just it generally just makes a mess um
Hmm.
of everything.
Yes, it does.
So, okay, I have like a billion questions now. So when you're talking about the energy coming in, like,
Hmm.
are you able to create more energy, or is this just energy that we already have coming in? Um, and then processing it. You're saying that you
Hmm.
process it, like if you're having grief, then you process it. What are some ways, like,
Yeah.
process it that you found are great?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's a part that I haven't really looked at, Faith, is the piece of like, can I create more energy? And as I look at it now from that perspective of what I just said about this universal energy flow, I don't know that we can create energy because I think energy is energy, but what I think we could do is open the conduit. Okay, so imagine you've got the hole that the energy is flowing in, and we can expand that so more can come in. Okay, so I think it's more like
Yeah.
that as
Okay.
opposed to creating more. I just open up to more energy. You notice how maybe after you start working out again, you feel more open to more energy. So we can
Yeah.
open the conduit for that and have more flow. And then the second part of your question, could you state that again?
Yeah. When it shows up, you said that when
Mm.
it shows up, like not getting rid of it, like processing it, like
Yeah, yeah.
moving it, like,
That part I haven't explored as much yet, but I'm looking into that as I continue my own personal development of like when the energy flows in. is there something in me? Like, let's just use grief as an example. If there's, maybe inside this body of mine, there is this part of me that's feeling a little grief. Maybe I got this grief pocket stuck in my shoulder or around my heart or something. And I can feel that energy come in. And often I can make a conscious choice and go, okay, I'm going to feel into that grief. I'm going to let that flow and open yourself up to those tears of sadness. I've sat with someone for this exact purpose at one point. I was feeling grief about stuff, just general grief, not even specific grief. And she held space while I just wept. I mean, heavily wept for like 30 minutes. And that was the processing. And then it was all cleared. And it was like that was gone. But I could at the same time have taken that energy through and instead going, I don't want to touch that grief. I'm going to channel it over here. And I think that can be fine, especially because I do think there is a right time and a right place for the expression of energy through us. But if you do it too much, then this other part over here that needs that expression starts to grow and fester. And you really do want to be sure you're kind of channeling that energy around and cleaning out all the crevices.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that the energy building in our bodies, like you're talking specifically about grief or whatever, causes like issues within our bodies like inflammation or
Absolutely.
heart disease or like
Yeah.
just examples. I'm not uh,
Absolutely. I think 100% that it does. And I also think that especially when we look at the word itself, okay, so when energy flows, if we let it flow, there should be ease. And when we don't, we get dis-ease, okay, which is disease. And so when we block stuff, that's where disease comes from because we blocked flow. And so I do think it's super important that we continue to let the energy flow in whatever ways our body is calling for. And to do that, of course, you have to be tuned into your body. I think there's great exercises I've taught in the past, and often when I'm guiding people on a journey is about tapping into what are you feeling in your body? How is it manifesting and what is that? You got to have an awareness of your body, really.
So do you take like a mental checklist in the morning, like say how I'm feeling, like what's happening? Because I know I go back and forth. I don't do this
Mhm.
consistently, but like as soon as my eyes pop up and I'm like, okay, how are we today? Like, is there any pain? Is there anything like heaviness feeling, like the emotions? Almost just like I don't know if you know anything about school bus driving. I used to be a school bus driver, and every morning we'd have to do a checklist and check out the bus and make sure the headlights are working and make sure the oil is at the right levels and make sure, all these things. So almost like running through a checklist in my head, but doing the
Mhm.
emotions and the feelings and like the physical and all that stuff as well. Is that something that you do or something that you think of?
It's not really something that I go through like a mental checklist, but what I do instead, and again, like kind of like you, I'm not as I haven't ingrained it as a good habit as it could be, but I find meditation is effective.
Mm.
And in quieting of the mind, you allow the other stuff to appear. You allow in the quieting to notice. Like, have you ever done this? If you're in a house and normally there's lots of noise going on, there's a TV going, there's a radio or whatever thing. If you cut out all the other sound and then you start to notice, oh, well, there's this sound that I never noticed before. That's kind of, it could be, oh, I noticed the hum of the refrigerator that I've never noticed before, or the air conditioning unit outside the window, or whatever that may be. We can't really notice that until we get quiet. And that's
Mm.
why I think it's so important to have a meditation practice. And again, I haven't been doing it as consistently as I like to. But when I do, it really does. In getting quiet, I start to see, oh, I notice I could use a little bit of this flow or that flow or whatever it may be. It starts to come up for me because I'm paying attention in the quiet.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good analogy. Like the house, because I notice like I don't have a radio playing and I don't have the TV on 90% of the time. Um, and when it's quiet in there, I can hear like the house breathing and like, you hear the stuff in the house
Mhm. Yeah,
itself, and they say that an empty house will deteriorate quicker, I should say, quicker than a full house, which is
Yeah.
is fascinating. Um, so when you're talking about moving energy, And do you do that during your meditations as well? Like you move the energy, and how does that work? Like tell me about that. I'm
Yeah,
fascinated.
I don't usually move energy during my meditations because I'm trying to actually just be quiet with everything
Okay.
and let settle into the beingness of
Mm.
my body, my breath, and quieting the mind, which of course our minds are, the job of the mind is to think, and and one of the things, and I'm a certified Dharma teacher and meditation guide. And one of the things that I think a lot of people get wrong about meditation is they think, oh, well, meditation, you're supposed to be able to quiet your mind to where you're not thinking at all. It's like, no, that's not it. What the goal should be for meditation is just to notice your thinking and bring awareness to it. And
Okay.
so that you shorten the gap between your mind starts wandering, and while your mind's wandering, you're all over the place. And then you go, oh, wait a minute, I'm wandering again, And so it's more a matter of just slowing it down, calming, noticing your breath, breathing in, breathing out, and that quiet. And so it's not really pulling in energy, it's quieting the energy that's there so that you can really listen.
Oh, I love that. What is a Dharma teacher? Is that what did I say?
Uh,
Did I say
yeah,
that
yeah.
right?
Yeah, Dharma teacher. So, Dharma is the teachings of Buddha, essentially, is the Dharma. And so I'm certified in that. I'm a Buddhist, and it's just one of my belief systems. And I will clarify too. Um, so many people think of Buddhism as a religion. I don't think of it as a religion. It's not. There's no deity in it. Buddha was not a deity. So it's just really, it's a philosophy of living, a way of life. And so it's the practice that I do is that. And so certification as a Dharma teacher, as I studied it more and got that certification.
Holy cow. Like, okay. Like I had no idea that this podcast episode was going to go in this direction. No. So let me just have full clarity here. When I invited you in to be on here, and I switched up my intake form based upon the podcast cruise. So the intake form that you filled out was me revamping the one that I currently had for guests coming in. And so I
Mhm.
asked you to give me 3 questions on grief because I'm like, I'm going to make my job easier. But I've always been a fan of, like, having the conversation and making sure that it's a good flowing conversation rather than basing it on questions that may or
Mhm.
may not, or trying to make sure that I get these questions in. And so now I have, like, all these other questions because I had no idea about the ayahuasca. I had no idea about the meditations, no idea about all of these things coming into this. And so thank you for bringing this and sharing it
Sure. Of
in here
course.
because I think that there's so much more for helping people with grief than just going to a session and talking about your feelings and emotions. I think
Mm,
we need to get more into the processes of pushing those emotions out in a healthy and viable manner rather than just tamping them off, shutting them down, and going back to work as usual. Um,
yeah.
and so I thank you so much for sharing this and talking about it because not a lot of people do, especially when this isn't the world that you work in the grief world. Uh,
Yeah.
it can be a little, I'm sure, a little scary to put it out there like that in the grief world because you're like, oh crap, are we going to heal grief? No, grief is going to be there. It's just an emotion that keeps going,
Yeah.
and we experience it every day from the moment we take our first breath to the day we take our last one. Um, And you've given me a lot of ideas and a lot of things that I want to incorporate and further go down the rabbit hole and look at them and do research on them and do all the things on them. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Of course, my absolute pleasure. Love talking about this.
So in all of this, how did this does it did were you a certified Dharma teacher or instructor? I don't even know what the words are. Um, when your mom passed?
I was, yes.
Did that, help you with, the grieving process at that time? Like, had you known, like, some portion, like, of moving this energy and stuff, and you knew that grief was just energy?
Actually, you know what? I want to change my answer. As I look in my timeline, and I'm really terrible at
I
timeline and
I
memory of
am too.
when things happen in a timeline. And so, no, I was not as
Okay.
well. Well, hold on. I'm not sure. Let me just put it that way
No,
to be
that's fine.
clear. I'm not real sure. But I can say that, yeah, I had a lot of this already, the training. I've already been a Buddhist for a long time. Okay.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I'll also say then about this too, and in the Buddhist philosophy, is there's the expression that pain is inevitable. You cut
Mhm.
yourself, you get hurt. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Yes.
Suffering is when we go and bemoan our state and we complain about our state. And there's this, I've also been kind of combining that with a little bit of pragmatism, and that when someone passes, and a lot of times the grief, I think we feel mostly at the passing of a person or a pet, but we could also feel grief about the loss of a job or the having to move, losing your home. I mean, there are a lot of other things that you could feel grief about. But when you really think about it, it's all, I believe, and just for sake of conversation around it, that it's about us missing something. It's
Yeah.
about us wanting something, and especially in the death of another person, because we know we'll never have that back.
Right.
And it's that sadness and that longing that creates the grief. Whether it could be the loss of a job you'll never get back. It could be divorce and grief through that. I mean, there's so many elements of it, but I think it's that longing of something to be different than it is.
Yes.
And in Buddhism, the big practice is in being okay with what is. Because when you can do that, then the suffering goes away.
Mhm.
And it's not that you won't feel the pain of the loss, but the suffering around it starts to dissipate. And so that's kind of been my thinking and evolutionary process for myself for years, even before my mom died.
Oh, that's yes. We had people look at me, a little odd sometimes when I say I don't believe in, like, good and bad, I believe in what is.
Hmm.
Because whether it's good for me or bad for me, it's gonna be the opposite for someone else,
Yeah.
and so it's a relative term to whoever's speaking it.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. When we lost Cassandra, it was the thought of never being able to make those memories with her again, never being able to, see her get married or have children or all of these things.
Hmm.
And then you start going into the thoughts of, "Well, I shouldn't outlive my child." All of those things, which
Mm.
are inherently it's neither true nor false because they are things that happen, and
Yeah.
it happens. Like, that's reality. And so coming to grasp with reality. So I had another coach on here and he was great and he talked about what did he say? I'm gonna butcher it so bad. I know I am. But along the lines of don't argue with reality. Like when you say that I should have passed before my daughter, that's arguing with reality because the reality is I didn't.
Yeah.
So I thought, "Ah, that's a beautiful way to look at it, and it takes away, like, all that sting, all that hurt, because the reality of my life is I lost my daughter. The reality of my life is I lost my
Mm.
granddaughter,
Mm.
and when you start to go and think along those terms, all you're left with are the beautiful memories. Yeah, sometimes they're painful because you realize that you're not gonna get to have those, but I don't have to keep, like you said, um, keep prolonging this pain and prolonging this
Mm.
suffering and keep going with it.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
great.
It really is, and it's interesting you say that. I think it was Byron Katie as part one of her teachings that she also
Mm,
says something like that. That is, never fight reality because you will always lose. And
yes,
so
and I think
it's
that's where he got it from,
yeah,
was Byron Katie, yes,
yeah. So
which makes
and it's
perfect
so true.
sense. It makes perfect
It
sense.
does.
I had put a post up on my social media pages. It's been a couple weeks now, And it was, if you could put your grief in a box and put it on the tallest shelf of the tallest bookcase, how would you feel for the day if you just had 24 hours? And a lot of the people that responded on there, they didn't know how they would live because they're starting to identify themselves with their grief, and it was becoming
Mm,
them. And so I thought that
right.
was very interesting. Um, have you seen that? Like, I know you're not in the grief space, but like, have you ran across that with people in your world?
No, I haven't, but I can totally see what you're just saying there, that I imagine that could be all consuming. That you start to identify as that. I've seen people do this in other things, even other than grief, where they
I was gonna
now,
say, like, losing a major job would be that way too. Like, well, gosh, that should have been mine, and
hmm
I was poised for great destiny, and then all of a sudden I was swooped.
yeah,
And then, but they're identifying with that loss as opposed to
hmm
like, okay, this happened, now what?
yeah. Yeah, it's rough. I can't imagine being in that situation. And you talk about the loss of a child. I mean, that's always been one of my greatest fears. If anything happened to my son, how would I handle that? And I don't know. Um, I can't even imagine it, and I try to not think about it.
Yeah.
Um, and those who have, I'm just like in awe of the resilience. Um, yeah, a friend of mine, and I'd known him for years, but didn't know this particular aspect. But he lost two sons in a
Mm,
period of a year to overdoses, and both young. And I was just like, wow. And I had no idea. And like, yet he was still functioning in the world. And so for me, I was like, yeah, that just blows me away.
I think that, as I've been in this grief world for a couple years now, um, the people that do podcasts and the people that do the coaching and stuff, and just the everyday people, like, because it's everyday people that lose loved ones. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to lose someone in your life or something. And to lose a child, it is, I think you just do what you have to do to survive at that point in time
Mhm.
until you can start really working on yourself, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
and figuring out what you need and being able to say, okay, here is what I need, and voicing those needs to people around you.
hmm
Um, but it's definitely a journey.
I can imagine.
It's definitely interesting. And I think that, like you said earlier, you didn't know how you'd be able to make it. Somehow you just find a way to.
Yeah.
Um, and it's usually not how you thought it would be. Like before we lost her, I would have never contemplated ayahuasca ever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when we lost her, I went straight to I wasn't raised religious. And so I didn't have any of that background. And so my first thought, and when I did reach out to the church that we were going to, we sporadically, when I married my husband, he was raised Catholic and then went to Lutheran when he turned 18 and then stopped going years later. And I had never really been into church.
hmm
And, and so, but he wanted to go, he wanted to be a part of it. So I'm like, okay, whatever, we'll go, we'll do this. And so we went into the church. And after we lost Cassandra, I remember the pastor and his wife had come over, and I thought, well, this would be good for the siblings to have someone talk to them. Well, as he was talking to my husband and the children, my mom and I and the pastor's wife were walking around, we were touring the house, whatever, and talking, and she had made the comment to me that I should be over this by now. I can't stay here too long. And that hit me, and I was angry with her for so long. Years I was angry with
hmm
her because how dare she? How dare she talk to me? This had only been like 2 days since we had lost her. And, and I'm at the point now, thankfully, I've done a ton of healing, a ton of work on myself to realize that when death happens on a magnitude of this, when it's like a mother and a child or a family, a parent and a child, I shouldn't say mother, but a parent and a child, um, people don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. they go
Mhm.
back to what their training is. And I don't think that there's good training on grief. There's not good training on like nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody
Yeah,
wants to go and oh, let's talk about death today. Okay, here we go. Step number one. Nobody wants to do that. And so I don't think that there's a lot of education out there on it, and definitely not good education.
right, right. It's interesting you say that. I've got two thoughts on it. One is that, I mean, the grieving process is different for everyone. So for anyone to say you should be done by now obviously shows that they're not really clued in on it at
Correct.
all. But
Correct.
the other part is, and this was interesting. You reminded me when you said we don't really have trainings on our teachings, but in Buddhism they do, and they
Okay.
actually I attended one that was very wild. And I forget the exact title of it, but I think it's something about the 32 stages of death or something along those lines. And what happened was, at least in the training that I received, this Buddhist monk had said when he died, he wanted to donate his body for the process and study of death. And literally, his body was out and open, and in my process of the training, we were looking at pictures of it
Hmm.
day after day as the process of the body itself decays. And because the person is no longer there, that person that we
Right.
love, but now you witness a body. And when you do this, and I think the whole process in Buddhism, if I can kind of encapsulate real quickly, I think the gist of it is that we're just these temporary we're just these temporary beings here, and that
Hmm.
it is part of the process that we live, we grow, we die. And when you accept that and you see it for in a very super real way, that it lifts some of the scariness of it, if you will. And so I remember going through that training and feeling like that it was very powerful for me. Um, yeah, and I think more people should have it. You're right. There's not a whole lot of training out there on death and dying.
No, and like even me, like even I, like when someone passes, or and I know it's I'm like, the cliche phrase, "How are you?" Well, no shit, how do you think I am? I'm
Right.
and as soon as it's out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, that was stupid. Why'd you
Yeah.
say that? But even I still do it. And so it's just like going back to like what we've been taught, what we've learned, and what we think like in those moments, those critical moments. Um, but I believe it was after Cassandra passed, when I believed and started realizing that we are spiritual beings and we're all still connected, just like, the roots in the ground, they're all connected to everything underground,
Mhm.
and in the air, everything up above is connected. And
Yeah.
so that's when I started diving in. And it was after my husband gave me several gentle nudges to listen to the NDEs, the near-death experiences, that it kind of opened my eyes to alternative forms of healing, if you will,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and taking a different approach than just, you know, the normal ones, the ones that are
Yeah.
always out there. Because I'm not one to just sit and say, "Oh, I'm feeling sad today." Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally get it.
So I thank you so much. I have eaten up enough of your time today. I could probably go on for about
Same
several
here.
hours. This has been fascinating. But thank you so much for being on here and sharing the story of your mom with us, and your process for re refocusing, moving that energy, and instead of
Mm.
letting it consume you, because guilt after loss is
Mm.
massive. And it
Mm.
consumes more people than I think that anyone knows.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I'm sure.
and we deal with guilt all the time, uh, probably more so than grief.
Exactly. Yes.
But I
Well, it's
appreciate being on here and sharing all of that with us.
well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Faith. I really love the topic, and I think it is something that I really appreciate you putting this out into the world, into the hands and the ears of the people who need it, because grief is something that it's something that we need to work through in a more, I don't know, heartfelt, educated way to make it easier and smoother in the transition. And it's a podcast like yours that makes that happen for people. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. That was the whole purpose of it coming out. I just felt a
Yeah.
calling to help people share their stories. And it's not necessarily stories of grief, it's stories of resilience and
Mm.
perseverance
Yeah.
and moving through it, the inevitable. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being a part of this podcast. Thank you, Michael, for being on, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Ciao.
Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of Release. All the links plus a few extras are posted in the show notes below. And if you think someone you know could benefit by listening to this episode, please share it with them. And as always, keep going, keep being, keep doing. You are amazing.